My wildest prediction is that people will stop making predictions.
It seems like in some ways the world has become a bit more irrational.
I think we should own up to that uncertainty. And one of the real problems, I think, politicians or any leader expressing with huge confidence about what's going to happen. What? Why? How do they know?
Sir David Spiegelhalter is one of the world's most important figures in statistics. He's an emeritus professor of statistics in the Center for Mathematical Studies at the University of Cambridge, and he previously served as the chair of the Winton Center for Risk and Evidence Communication. He's the author of The Art of Statistics, Learning from the Data, and The Art of Uncertainty, How to Navigate Chance, Ignorance, Risk, and Luck. Spiegelhalter is committed to making mathematics more accessible. Thank you so much for coming on the show, David.
Oh, a great pleasure to be here.
What's your wildest prediction for the future?
Yeah, I had some trouble with this, but my wildest prediction is that people will stop making predictions.
Where's the fun in that?
Exactly. No. What I mean by that is that I'm just fed up with pundits telling me, what will happen, what will happen, what will happen. And I think, well, hang on, it's all very well. Presumably these are things that could happen. What I want to know is what their judgment is about how likely they are to happen. So I would want any prediction to be linked with at least a rough number, rough odds. Is it 30 to 70 that it's going to happen, or is it 90 to 10 it's going to happen? Are they really certain, or is it just sort of 1 in 100 it's going to happen? Presumably, when we're talking about wildest predictions, we're talking about fairly unlikely events, because I think it's very unlikely that people will stop making these concrete predictions. But at least I'm honest with it. And I could give it, I think it would actually be really quite a low number. So I really think that I want to know whether when someone makes a prediction, whether it is a wild prediction or whether it's a fairly confident prediction.
You've already fried my brain a little bit by turning the question on its head about 3 times in one answer.
Yeah.
But didn't you say that at some point, I think in nature, you said that probability didn't exist?
No, it doesn't exist. Any probabilities that we quote, we just make up. They're just constructions. They're just assessments that we make of, the probability is going to rain tomorrow, the probability of what Trump might do next, the probability of climate change in a century or something like that. These are all numbers that we construct, and they don't exist out there in the outside world. And I don't even believe they're estimates of some true uncertainty, some true probability outside in the outside world. I don't think that exists either. So, but they're very useful numbers because, probabilities, we can't directly measure probability. It's not like temperature or length or heat or noise or anything. We haven't got a probabilityometer. These are all just judgments we make on the basis of our knowledge or experience or mathematical models or so on. But the one thing we can do is check how good those probabilities are through this idea of scoring rules that, if we say if something's got a 90% probability and it happens, well, that's pretty good. Essentially we were 10% out. If we said it only had a 20% probability it happened, we were 80% out, and that's really bad. And we can accumulate those scores, but what we don't accumulate are the 10% and the 80%. It was worked out years ago, right back in 1950, that in weather forecasting, that the correct way to do it is to penalize people by the square of the error. So if we're, for example, 0.1 out, we lose 0.1 squared. If we're 0.8 out, we lose 0.8 squared. So it's quite a harsh penalty system. And that's the penalty system that I talk about in my book a lot, and that's used, for example, in evaluating super forecasters, because in super forecasting competitions, nobody says what's going to happen. They do it properly. They always give things probabilities of what's going to happen, and then their probabilities get checked. It's the method used for assessing weather forecasts. I think it should be the method used for assessing predictions about football results and everything like that as well.
Do you think we are living in more uncertain times, or do we just talk about it more?
Yeah, everybody always thinks they're living in an age of uncertainty, and I look back in history and there were certain periods when, in the 1930s, for example, there's massive uncertainty, massive potential for major changes in the world. And then things kind of settled down a bit, apart from, of course, the threat of nuclear war in the early 60s that I vaguely remember. I think actually we are living in rather more uncertain times, and when both from a major political point of view about the unpredictability of what we have some rather unpredictable leaders in the world at the moment, to put it mildly, and but also from a personal point of view. I mean, when I'm a boomer, when I got out of university, which of course was completely free. I could almost choose which job I was going to go into, and I could stay in that job. I stayed in the same job for 32 years. And then you get a nice, final salary pension at the end. Wow. I mean, that's just a dream now. People will change jobs so much more often, a lot of insecurity, job insecurity. Kids, young people now have got a lot more uncertainty in their lives, I think, than I did.
And what, in sort of practical terms, do you think that kind of people or businesses can do to sort of deal with this?
Well, first of all, own up to it, I think, and just admit it. I mean, uncertainty is something we all live with. And in fact, of course, we enjoy. We don't want to know what's going to happen. We don't want to know how a football match is going to end, or how the whodunit is going to end, or what we're going to get for Christmas. We don't even want to know when we're going to die. Well, some people do, but very few, in fact. So we're as humans, we're completely used to living with uncertainty, and that's a great part of being human. God, I can't think of anything worse than knowing what was going to happen all the time. Really dreadful. But it can bring with it, of course, especially when it's about serious issues, considerable anxiety and discomfort. And so I think the first thing is to own up to it, both as humans. And some people are much better at dealing with it than others. I know people, I've got areas of my life where I genuinely get anxious about uncertainty, and others where I'm very happy to live with it. And I think it's the same for everybody. When it comes to organizations and even whole political systems, yes, I think we should own up to that uncertainty. And one of the real problems, I think, are politicians or any leader expressing with huge confidence about what's going to happen. What? Why? How do they know? And actually, if it's something that I think seems very alien to political thinking, to have that humility to admit that they don't know how things are going to work out. But, I think people who work in crises and, where there's, really quite rapid changes in information have got used to that and have got rather much better at communicating that basic uncertainty. And I think it's a skill that it would be very valuable to learn. We could see in the COVID pandemic, there was a huge uncertainty at the beginning. And yet some people just gave their opinion with absolute confidence. Of course, then found it really difficult to change their minds when the evidence changed.
It seems like in some ways the world has become a bit more irrational. Like it seems that the way the media environment works, there's a kind of fervor and there's a lot more emotion, and things become a kind of narrative rather than a kind of rational linear journey. Do you think that's happening? And if so, how do we kind of deal with that as rational people? How do we navigate that?
I never, in my new book, I hardly use the word rationality at all. The word humility appears huge numbers of times, but rationality doesn't. So I'm not keen on this appeal to rationality. I don't know what I can do. I studied this. I did mathematics of decision theory, for years and taught it. So I know about the theory of rational decision making, but actually in practice, of course, you can't directly apply it because it assumes you know all these numbers. You know about what's going to happen, the possible list of possible outcomes, what their value is. Well, how are you going to know what their value is after they've occurred? And then their probabilities. I mean, this is all nonsense. We just don't know this stuff. And so I'm not keen on the appeal to rational decision-making. I think much more important are issues of trustworthiness in terms of being true to the evidence that's available, of not trying to manipulate people's opinions, of being open about the uncertainties and about lack of evidence and things like that. So these are much more basic principles, I believe, of what you might call ethical discourse, the way that things should be in society. The problem is, of course, that assumes a very central ground where you're looking at balancing, weighing the positives and the negatives. And look what's happened in social media. There's just automatic polarization, just the frame of the discourse. I find it very upsetting because I'm very English. I try to be rather moderate and polite. And to see the language, which is aggressive, which is absolutely confident, even though people often haven't got a clue what they're talking about, express their opinions with absolute confidence. And of course, the aggression there, the lack of politeness. And so I find that very upsetting. And during COVID, for example, I was right in the middle trying to explain the data and understand what was going on and trying to explain it, and had quite a media profile. Being attacked from both sides, we might consider the two ends of the spectrum of the different, spectrum of opinion. And, I thought that was the right place to be. I wasn't alone. There were a number of people trying to hold that ground. But it was very unpleasant in a way. And I do think, of course, this is a platitude now to say that social media has encouraged a polarized form of discourse. I mean, it always was. I mean, I remember, back in the day in the UK in Parliament where, people would get into fights in the middle of the Parliament. I mean, there was a really polarized political situation in a way that isn't there now. The parties, in a sense, are much more similar now than they used to be. And so but in sort of social discourse, social media, I think it's a really negative step forward. It's development, and I feel very strongly that that means there's an even stronger role for what you might call trustworthy communication, to be in the middle. And now who is going to deliver that is a matter of debate.
It's always seemed like now is a very difficult time to be reasonable in a way. Anything that's about building bridges between two divided worlds to sort of attract scorn and attacks from both sides to some extent.
My discussions I've been having with people recently have, I'm sure we might get onto AI and its role. I think it could have a really positive role in this domain because, the AI programs I use are invariably polite. They tend to be really quite balanced. It's been built in their guardrails not to go into strongly, ideological views. They're polite, they're balanced, they're reasonable. They respond to prompts. They're like talking to a very reasonable person. They really are. It's the complete antithesis from what's going on social media when I go onto my favorite, large language model.
We'll come back to AI a little bit more later on, but just sort of focusing again a bit more on your book. You distinguish between different types of uncertainty. There's sort of risk, ignorance, and luck. Can you sort of break down each of those a little bit more and explain how we should think about them?
Not really types ones. They're just aspects of how uncertainty plays out in our life because, there's the essential unpredictability of existence and which is fine. And sometimes, so you can think of risk as the fact that we don't know how things are going to work out. And sometimes they work out badly and sometimes they work out well. And I kind of think that's risk. Everything is risk. When we don't know what the outcomes are going to be. Luck, I think, is just a way, I don't believe that it's a force of luck, but it is quite a nice way to just retrospectively describe things that have happened to us that were out of our control, that were unpredictable, and yet had a big impact. So we can say we're lucky or unlucky. No, I don't believe there's some goddess Fortuna looking over us, handing out the good luck or the bad luck. No, that's nonsense. But actually, it's quite useful, I think, and I write quite a lot about luck, and because there's been some great philosophical work on luck. To take apart when we're looking backwards on the way things have turned out in all their massive unpredictability and complexity, to take apart how it's been for us or a country or something. The fact that what actually happens is often the chain of an incredibly odd sequence of events, each of extraordinary unlikeliness. In particular, of course, our own births. I mean, the fact that each of us is here at all is just absolutely staggering and unlikely. Because
something we don't think about enough.
Oh, I know. Yeah. Have you thought about your conception?
It's completely nuts. It would make the kind of world's cheesiest motivational poster. But we're all extraordinary winners. Just by breathing right now.
Well, that's existential luck, which is a good term. Actually, that is the term for it. Of even existing. But because by in any sort of normal world, we wouldn't exist. We only exist by the strange, set of micro contingencies. So in my book, I do talk about my conception because I have I have researched it in some detail, including the weather at the time. So
It's completely crazy. It seems like as a species, we're pretty bad at understanding probability intuitively.
yeah.
We've got things like the Monty Hall problem. We've got like the Simpsons paradox. Why is that?
Yeah, I've been asked this, I've been working in this area for nearly 50 years, and I get asked, why do people find probability and statistics so unintuitive and difficult? And what I say is, well, after decades of research and thought, I finally concluded it's because they really are unintuitive and difficult. So we're absolutely right to find it difficult. Probability is not a natural. I mean, as I said, I have a fairly extreme view on this, that probability doesn't exist. We just made it up in the mid-1600s. It's very useful to pretend it exists and to act as if it does, but it's not actually there. It's not like we can have some intuition about weight and distance and time and things like that. It works quite well. Actually, when we get into big numbers or small numbers, it stops working. But with probabilities, whoa, no. Our intuition is very poor. Mine is terrible. And I've worked in this sea for so long. And if someone gives me a simple probability problem, I say, oh, well, hang on a minute. And I think, oh, wait.
Maybe this is not your area, but it always strikes me that a lot of people are quite proud to be bad at maths. You don't get people kind of boasting that they're not good at writing or boasting that they can't sing or something. Why is there a sort of culture where maths is sort of okay to be proud to be bad at? How do we get people to be better?
I think that's reduced now. I do think, it's always the classic statement, oh, well, I'm no good at maths, and that's it. I think people are more embarrassed about saying that. Maybe not quite as embarrassed as saying, I don't read or something like that, but I think people are more embarrassed about doing that. I mean, the need for data literacy, numeracy and data literacy, even for every citizen, is becoming increasingly important. And people should be embarrassed for saying I can't do maths. There's nothing to be proud of at all. I have a lot of sympathy because I think that many people did not get a good education at school, and maths is a particular subject that once you drop behind, then you kind of just lose it, and you think I can't do it, and it's a real shame. So I always ask people what happened, and it's usually because they were away from school, they had a bad maths teacher, and so on, had some break, and then they lost it, and then that was it. They gave up. And it's a real tragedy. But I mean, I'm involved in development of maths education, but it's wrong to think of it as maths education. The group I'm involved in is, wanting to rebrand it as mathematical and data education, MDE, so that it's seen, you want your good old-fashioned maths, your algebra and your geometry and things, but frankly, that's going to be useful or even interesting to quite a minority of young people. What is useful is both numeracy in the outside world, but also statistics, probability, modeling the real world, understanding evidence, being able to use numerical evidence to make judgments about claims that are being made about health, politics, and so on like that, interpreting the numbers that we hear in the news. This is basic skills for any citizen should have, let alone the professions that are increasingly having to use numbers and quantitative skills in their work. So there is this phrase, it's very ugly, quantitative literacy, which is the vital skill for modern, not just for modern, citizenship, but the modern economy. And that we need to make sure is as strong as possible.
What sort of tools would you give people as a way to try and be more comfortable with an ambiguous future? What should people be doing?
Yeah, well, I think, in my book and when I'm talking, I try to give some training, try to just in a small way train people to think probabilistically so that, difficult to do it in the future, but when you've just got an audience, I'll ask them, do you think that the Eiffel Tower is taller than which is taller, the Eiffel Tower or the Shard in London? And they have to say which one they think is. But I say, I don't want to know which one you think. I want your probability. It's either the Eiffel Tower or the Shard. And then I can sort it. I tell you, the Eiffel Tower is 14 meters higher. But, then they can score themselves. So you can train people incredibly quickly to think probabilistically rather than categorically. Not to make these categorical, I think this. No, I don't want to know. I don't know what you think. I don't care about that. I want to know how likely you are to be right. How much do you know? And you can train people not to be overconfident, to, most people, to actually get a good idea of what they know, how ignorant they are. And that, I think, would be one of the most major things. I think all this stuff should be taught in schools so that either when you're predicting football matches or just confidence in actual facts, that people learn to express themselves probabilistically, which has come right back to my ideal wild prediction that people in the future would express their judgments probabilistically, even just roughly, rather than categorically.
So moving on to AI, just because, it's a fascinating topic for everyone, but I think it's especially interesting when it comes to the way in which generative AI works, which is inherently about probable combinations and plausibility. But also, I'm fascinated by how people are actually using it in their life at the moment. So to start with, when it comes to you doing what you do, whether it's writing books, whether it's going on podcasts, whether it's studying probability, how are you using it, and are you disappointed somewhat in what you're getting out
Yeah,
from
I
it?
find it extraordinary. I use a particular LLM, which I got rather fond of. It seemed to have a bit more humility built into it and admitting its possibility of error. And I use it all the time in my work. I find it incredibly useful when I'm just sort of researching a topic and I want a quick summary of bullet points that explores the space and gives it to me. I'm very wary about using them for factual matters. Always. I mean, it does say at the bottom, please check any things, and I have hallucinations and everything, but it can get, I just asked it last week, got my birthday wrong. Well, that's the top of Wikipedia is there. And so, a couple of weeks ago, I was asked to do, choose a statistic for the statistic of the year for 2024. So, of course, I'd go and ask my large language model to give me some good statistics for 2024. And it came up with a really good one. And then I asked it, where did he got it from? And then it said, well, I made it up. Oh, for heaven's sake. Well, thanks for telling me. So, for generating ideas, for summarizing reports, for coding, it's brilliant and all of that. But for factual matters, goodness me, you've got to check it.
And what do you think the kind of longer term implications of AI being in society will mean?
Huge. And it is, it is quite extraordinary what it can do at the moment. But we've had decision support systems, algorithmic decision making around for decades. I used to work on it. I worked on uncertainty in AI 40 years ago. That's when the conferences started. Yeah, the first uncertainty in AI conferences were in the mid-1980s. We thought we'd solved it. Anyway, but sadly wrong. So no, it's going to develop, and there's a lot of work on putting better metrics for uncertainty into large language models. So it's got an idea of what it knows and what it doesn't know, and it can tell you its confidence and its conclusions and so on. It's very exciting. I mean, I think it only starts becoming trustworthy really when it can do that.
Do you think it will kind of lead to breakthroughs within the space of statistics?
I don't know. It'll become very useful for statistics in terms of its, you can ask it to do things, ask it to do plots, ask it to arrange stuff. I'm not sure about breakthroughs. I'm not sure about that. But what I usually quote is a lovely statement that when a radiologist was asked, well, is AI going to replace radiologists for reading, x-rays and scans and things? And he said, well, no, I don't think it's going to replace radiologists, but it might replace radiologists who don't use AI. Mm-hmm. And so I would say that in my profession, as in so many professions, we've just got to learn to use it in the best appropriate way. And for that use to be, properly evaluated and so on.
It's fascinating. So David, thank you so much for coming on the show.